Welcome to On the Front Burner, where we give you a taste of important issues bubbling up in education and the world today.
Welcome to the On the Front Burner podcast. I'm Matt O'Donnell, the Tech Innovation Specialist and History Content Coordinator at the Sonoma County Office of Education. On this episode, we'll look at the Bracero Program. The new California Social Science Framework adds a Bracero Program to the content taught in both 4th and 11th grade United States history classes because it was so often overlooked. Joining us today is Nate Sleeter from George Mason University. He is the manager of the Bracero Archive, and he also used the archive to create curricular content for teachers. Hi, Nate. Welcome to the podcast. And can you give us a little background about yourself?
My background is I'm a former classroom teacher, former history and special education teacher. I've taught middle school and high school. I went back to school about 7 to 8 years ago to get my PhD in history. I've since earned my PhD in history, and for the last 7 years or so, I've worked at the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media here near George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. And what I mainly do is work on websites and other digital materials, resources, online courses, in-person professional development to help support sort of the active learning of history and civics and government in K through 12 classrooms.
Tell us a little bit about the Bracero Archive.
The Bracero Archive is a project funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities from 2007 to 2010. Involved various stakeholders from across the country, one of us being here, the Roy Rosenzweig Center, History and New Media at George Mason, also the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, Brown University, the Institute of Oral History at University of Texas, El Paso. And the idea was to collect source material and especially oral histories from participants in the Bracero Program. And if you think about the timing, 2007, 2010, Bracero Program itself was 1942 to 1964. A lot of the people who participated in this program are nearing the end of their lives. So it was a way to kind of collect that first person testimony about what the Bracero Program was actually like from the participants, and really use the ability of a digital website to collect as many sources as possible and then make them as freely available as possible, because the fact is that this is an area of history that even scholars often don't give as much attention to as they probably should.
What were some of the economic conditions in the United States that created the need for the Bracero Program?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. The economic conditions in the United States, I think there's a number of ways to look at that. The immediate economic conditions, if we're talking about 1942, the obvious thing that comes to mind is World War II, right? World War II meant this huge industrial production to get the United States ready for a world war. And that involved basically bringing a lot of people into high-paying factory jobs who had never had those experiences before. It also, because of the need for soldiers and manpower in that way, it took a bunch of people out of the labor market who normally would be doing those jobs. As a result, you had other jobs that required that were then had pressure on them in some way to be filled. One of those certainly were agricultural jobs in the Western United States. So you had the growers, these agricultural firms, who wanted workers and wanted to pay workers what they'd previously been paying workers, which is not very much. It's also not only a low wage job, it's a seasonal job. So agricultural worker from their agricultural firm from their standpoint wants to pay someone just to work for the part of the season that they need them, and then not have to pay them for the rest of the year. So they're in kind of a bind. And one thing they could have done, one thing the federal government asked them to do, was perhaps bring in workers from other parts of the United States where working conditions unemployment still existed, like the Appalachian region, the American South. They didn't want to do that. They pushed for this agreement then to bring seasonal workers from Mexico to work in the fields in agricultural areas in California and the rest of the West, which is it's sort of ironic because during the Great Depression, just immediately preceding World War II, many of those same workers had been forced out of the country as um, Americans, looked for jobs. Unemployment was really high. So it was bringing back some of those same workers, and certainly from the same populations who had been forced to leave the country just prior to the war.
Can you tell us why the Bracero program ended?
The Bracero program ended, I think, for a variety of reasons. First of all, it's sort of interesting why it continued. It was pitched as sort of this temporary wartime measure, right? The idea that, well, there's low unemployment during the war, we need labor to come fill this role, but it winds up not only lasting past the end of the war, but by almost a good 2 decades after the end of the war. And the reason for that is that there's still there still was a difficulty of these growers to find a labor force willing to work for the amount of wages that they wanted to pay. So they pushed and lobbied very effectively, as it turns out, to keep the Bracero program active. In terms of why it ended, you're seeing a lot of shifts in the mid 1960s in terms of attitudes towards immigration. The larger picture of immigration and policy that you might want to look at for thinking about the Bracero program would begin with the immigration restrictions that culminated in the 1924 Immigration Act, which really restricted which populations can come to the United States based on a quota system of the country of origin. That was something that growers in the Western U.S. often got exceptions for bringing in Mexican workers, at least until the Great Depression put a little more focus on that kind of practice and led to more restrictions. But in the 60s, you see a complete sort of a change in the repeal of that 1924 Johnson-Reed Act or Immigration Act, and that allowed for a much more open system of immigration, which I think then the ending of the Bracero program was also part of.
What are some of the ongoing legal issues that have resulted from the Bracero program?
Yeah, that's a great question, and yet that's definitely something that has been in the background of the Bracero program since it ended. Continuous challenges over pay that wasn't received in the courts have been going on. I'm not an expert in some of those challenges, but it's definitely, I would say that'd be a great follow-up to have students do, is to investigate what were some of these judicial challenges to the Bracero program and what was the outcome of them, because it's my understanding that they're still going on.
How would you recommend that students and teachers begin using the archive?
The way the archive is situated now, I mean, I think it can be difficult. I think it's definitely one of those situations where it was try to get as much recorded, try to get as much uploaded as possible, and then it can be used later. And well, we're definitely going to be doing more of the curating, as I said, over the next year or so, to try to bring the things we think will be most relevant for teachers and students to the fore and feature them in various inquiry activities. That said, a lot of students would be able to go in and just start looking for particular pieces of evidence in kind of like a scavenger hunt basis and finding, can you find an example of a Bracero contract? Can you find an example of a phrase book that Bracero workers might have used? Examples of what kind of photographic evidence of the different crops that Braceros might have picked, that kind of thing. One thing that I'm still sort of chewing over and thinking over is how to handle some of these oral history interviews. Which might not surprise anyone. They're mostly in Spanish, so that presents a challenge in terms of translating all of them, translating part of them, sort of finding the most relevant parts. However, I think that there's a huge opportunity to have students go in and having students with different language backgrounds go in and then use their abilities to translate part of it, to try to find different pieces of it, working in groups to kind of show that it's a great object lesson that bilingual abilities are a great asset and a tool for historians to use too as they go and look at historical evidence that might be in different languages. So those are a few ideas. We're still kind of playing around with those. We're in the stages of how to make the resources as relevant as possible for teachers and students, but those are a few ideas to get started.
One final question. What is the most important thing people need to know about the Bracero program?
I think this is a real historian answer, and I apologize if it's too much of a historian answer. But I think It's the complexity of it. That there is no one easy takeaway for something like this. And like you sort of, as I mentioned before about the fact that Bracero program and Bracero program like guest worker agreements, get brought up as possible solutions, as possible ways to address immigration. Um, and often it seems like a much cleaner idea, like it's a solution that can just tie a bow on an entire issue and then sort of make everyone happy. But it's often much more complex when you actually get into it and you actually understand what the workers went through and the motivations of the workers, the motivations of the growers, the motivations of the United States government and Mexican government. There's a lot of competing things going on, and the big thing that I take away from it is that this idea that people are just much more than just their labor. You have to, when you think of policies that affect people, you can't treat them as if their labor is separate from their personhood. You need to craft policies, and governments need to look into ways to consider the whole person in the whole community and not just act as if you can cut out that labor part and not deal with the rest of what people need.
Well, that is definitely a great message to share with everyone, Nate. Thank you so much for your time today and for speaking with us and your expertise on the Bracero Archive and the Bracero Program.
Fantastic, Matt. It was great talking to you.
For additional information on the Bracero Program, including the Bracero Archive, you can find links on our website. The website for this podcast is onthefrontburnerpodcast.com.
Thank you for listening to On the Front Burner. This podcast was produced by the Sonoma County Office of Education.